Hello hackers, and welcome back. We're going to move on to the last genre that we'll be decoding this semester. So I hope you enjoyed the week of chill and were able to get your journal entries in Saturday by midnight. Remember that I don't grade those until the end of the semester, but what counts is that you have at least 200 words per entry and that you have those entries done on time. So we're moving into a different genre, so that means that there are different expectations for this genre. And those expectations, just like the other genre, we'll be able to decode by using examples. The purpose of this, our last and final blog, is to write about identity in the digital community that you chose. So I'm going to show you an example of a digital community that I belong to and show you something that might work as evidence so that I could use to explain how identity works in this particular digital community. This digital community is another one of the cyberpunk communities that I belong to, and if you're not familiar with cyberpunk, remember I did show you an example last time from a cyberpunk group. This is a science fiction, a community that comes around, or a fan community of science fiction, but a particular type of sci-fi. So cyberpunk came about in the kind of mid-'80s and has been an influence in popular culture ever since. So The Matrix might be a text that you're familiar with, or something more recent, Altered Carbon on Netflix. These would be cyberpunk texts. So beyond just being fans of cyberpunk, there are a lot of kind of cyberpunk cultural attitudes that come along with that, and also evidence in these digital communities of how identity is expected to be performed or constructed or followed in those particular communities. So these are some group rules from the admins. I had to look the first one up because I didn't know what an edgelord was, but it seems like somebody who is basically trolling or just trying to get a reaction. Number 2, we could see that this is a common theme in these cyberpunk groups, that they're particularly anti-Nazi. And you might ask, well, aren't most people anti-Nazi? This particular aversion to Nazism is because of the kind of infiltration of Nazi ideology into certain punk groups that has happened since the 70s. So it's a particular thing with these particular types of communities. Spam, doxing, which is getting mad at somebody and releasing all their information online, and a list of questions that you have to ask before you get into this community. So this community is very concerned with the identities of the people who are allowed to join. But once we get into this community, we can start looking at posts and see how different people perform or construct their identity in relationship to the community. Now, an easy way of getting into this is looking at the moderators. How do the moderators use their identity as moderators to kind of maintain the community? Some of you have already looked into that a little bit and have kind of moved in that direction with your informational reports. We're just going to add to that and focus this blog on identity. Alright, so let's move to the blog instructions. So you'll see that this is a digital identity argument blog. So all the examples that we'll be looking at will have to do with scholarly arguments. And they will have to do with scholarly arguments about identity in certain digital networks or communities. You'll notice that Even though there are some similarities between the between the report blog and the identity argument blog, there are some notable differences. Just like the report blog, we want to cite information to be accurate. We want to put quotes in quotes and be upfront when we're paraphrasing or putting stuff into our own words, so we make sure that we're not claiming ideas that are not ours. But it is a different genre, and it's going to have different expectations or common codes, and we're going to have to decode it just like we did the other two genres. Decode it into its common codes and then create a word cloud from there so that we all have an idea of how our group socially constructs these expectations. Another way of saying that without the theoretical language is how our class groups see these genres differently. So this is going to be the hardest genre, and in part it's going to be the hardest genre to work with because it's going to be a thesis-driven argument. Now we're going to read several examples. This week we're going to read Dana Boyd about Myspace, and we're going to read Tom Bolstroff about Second Life and how identity is performed or constructed in those spaces. One of them is a digital network, the MySpace. The other is certainly a digital community. And I think that for this assignment, since you all did such amazing work in reporting about your digital communities, that we can stick with those same digital communities. And especially since you've already done research on these digital communities, we can just do a little extra research or use the raw data you already have to really make a good argument for how identity works in those communities. Now, you can switch up communities if you found that you picked a community that was maybe closer to a network, that didn't have that interaction that you were looking for. You can certainly switch up. It just means you'll have to do a little extra research work to get caught up. So you might notice that I've used terms like how identity is constructed or performed, and these might seem a little daunting, might seem a little theoretical, but I think that those terms will make more sense once we've read Boyd and Bolstroff. And the examples that we read will not only help us with those terms, but they'll also be good examples of arguments about identity in particular digital spaces. So we're going to do the same thing. We're going to come up with the codes for the word cloud. You'll notice on this digital identity argument blog instructions here, I have several questions that will just kind of help you think about how identity works in your particular digital community. So if you think this is a little bit daunting, you might look at those questions and try to answer those questions for yourself, and it'll help you move in the right direction. This is going to be a definitional argument. So it's a particular type of argument. It's one in which we define identity for the group. Most of the other things are going to be the same. It's going to be the same word count, about 1,000 words, and we're going to have to cite things in MLA, and you'll want to bring in possibly some quotes too from the people that we've read to help you define identity. That'll just help bolster the ethos of your own argument. And you'll read about ethos, so no worries there. This is also going to be a persuasive argument, right? It's a persuasive blog. You're trying to persuade me and your group members that based on the evidence from your digital community, this is really how identity works in that digital community. It's also going to be arguable in the sense that any reasonable person might be able to disagree and have a different interpretation based on a different explanation of the evidence, or maybe different evidence from that digital community. So this is what I call a cheat code, and it's just a very simple way of boiling down an argument to its basics. And there are many cheat codes, and if you want to learn them all, take the next class with me, analytic writing, and we'll use all the cheat codes. But I don't want to overwhelm you right now. I just want to give you one, and it's very simple. A definitional argument is basically, when you boil it down, you're arguing that X equals Y. X identity equals however your research moves you to explain identity working in that particular digital community. You might say that if I were defining identity overall in the analog exile community, I would say identity of the group members is certainly anti-racist. That would be one way of thinking about the identity formation in this digital community. And then I could go find particular posts where people post about anti-racist stuff to kind of perform or construct their identity in this group. The Y portion of this cheat code is really broken down into different criteria, and you'll read about this. But the criteria are basically just the ways that you, the things that you focus on to back up your definition of what identity is in this digital community. So one thing you might want to do is do more research on your digital community. If you feel like you didn't really focus enough on identity, or you'd like to get some more information about how identity works, you might want to focus on a particular type of identity. Trolling is a particularly insidious type of identity that is taken on by people in several different groups. So you might focus on how trolling operates or doesn't operate in that digital community. You might see it shut down in a particular post. You might also focus more positively on the moderators, right? What does it mean to have the identity of a moderator in a particular group? And you might also find that different people form different identities or blocks of identities based on particular disagreements in a group, right? There might be some conflict going on that causes people to split and think about their identity a little bit differently. But one thing that we're going to get out of this unit is that you're going to find that identity isn't something that is set. It is something that we do in different communities differently. And what I hope you'll be able to do is make a good argument for how it works in the digital community that you chose. So, lastly, these scholarly readings that we'll be doing are certainly models, because we're going to have to break down the common codes and create a word cloud, just like we have with all the other genres. A word cloud of what is to be expected for this genre. And remember, expectations, or these common codes, don't mean that it doesn't mean that every instance of the genre has every instance of those expectations, but that we can just reasonably expect to see something of that one of the, that common code in that particular genre. So for instance, with our narrative genre, we could expect to see dialogue, right? That's just something you could expect to see in a story. With our report genre, we could expect to see headings. That's just something you would expect to see in the report genre. With the argument genre, headings are not as important, but there are other things, probably less obvious things that are very important, particularly the structure of your logic and your argument. What we're doing, we're going to read Dana Boyd on Myspace, and we're going to read Tom Bolstroff on Second Life. Now, Myspace, for those who are not familiar with it, let me find it here. If you're not familiar with Myspace, you might just not be old enough. Myspace is still around, but it really hasn't been in use really as long as Facebook has been out. So it was kind of one of the first social networks that people started using en masse, in large numbers. So MySpace is still around, and I think maybe bands use it or something, but most people have moved to Facebook. In this study that Boyd did, though, she looks at teenagers who are using MySpace. Now, one important thing that I want to point out is MySpace is not a digital community as much as it is a digital network. So why are we looking at these teenagers using MySpace? And why is it important to look at teenagers overall? Well, instead of, like, say, the elderly, like we did with the one study about fun and elderly culture. Well, I think it's important because psychologists say that identity is formed in your teenage years. So this is an important study because these social networks were just coming about when Boyd was doing this. So she was looking at how teenagers formed their identities with these type of social networking tools that were used in a newly formed internet, if you will. And so the argument, what you'd really take from Boyd is how identity is formed and how important social networking can be to forming those identities. But again, MySpace is a network and not a particular digital community. We'd have to go in and look at particular digital communities that used MySpace, and not very many people really use it. I haven't done much research on it. It might be interesting to look at to see what communities still use it. But we're going to move on from there, and that'll help us understand the kind of philosophical or theoretical understanding of identity that we'll need to know to be able to carry out the research for this blog and to be able to write this blog persuasively. The next author that we'll read is Tom Bolstroff and his study on Second Life. Now, Second Life, I think, really can be said to be a digital community. In fact, there are several digital communities within Second Life. It's not so much a game as it is kind of a 3D world. You create an avatar, you run around the world and interact with people. And there are several specific communities within Second Life. Now, Tom Bolstroff is an anthropologist, and he went and studied Second Life as an anthropologist would, and he immersed himself in the community to be able to study it. And so one thing he's doing is doing a really good job of making scholarly arguments about identity, but he's also focusing on the particular digital community that he's involved with in Second Life. So the second example isn't just telling us about identity, it's telling us about how identity operates in a very particular digital community. And that's what I'm looking for you to do in this blog. So I will repeat that you might want to pull out phrases that seem important to you for this blog, so that you might use them, for these studies, so you might use them in your blog. And it will just, if you use citations from Boyd and or Bolstroff, it will just increase the ethos or the credibility of your own blog. All right, well, I hope this move into a new genre isn't too confusing or daunting, but I think the readings will help and the quizzes will help us. Make sure and follow along the learning module and perform all the steps that are listed there. If you have any questions or concerns, you could always send me a message on Discord, or email, or call me, and I hope to see you all online.